You forget what God does for you. That's the problem nobody wants to admit. 3 months after He answers a prayer that brought you to your knees, you can barely remember the weight of the thing you carried, let alone the moment He lifted it. By the end of this, you'll understand why a cheap notebook and a pen might be the most powerful spiritual discipline you've ignored. Think about the last time you were genuinely desperate before God. The kind of prayer where your voice cracked. The kind where you ran out of words and just sat there breathing. Now try to recall the exact words, the specific fear behind them. The date. You can't. Most of us can't. And that gap between what God has actually done and what you can actually remember is where doubt builds its house. Your memory is a leaking bucket, and you've been trying to carry a lifetime of His answers in it. There's a reason Scripture is obsessed with remembering. Over and over, God commands His people to build altars, set up stones, write things down, recite the works of His hand to their children. In Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 12, the warning is sharp. Then take heed, lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. That verse is talking to people who literally walked through a split sea, and God still saw the danger. They would forget if they could forget the Red Sea. What makes you think you'll remember the Tuesday He came through for you? This is where the prayer journal stops being a Pinterest aesthetic and starts being a weapon. Writing your prayers down is the closest thing the Christian life has to a video recording of your own soul. The date is there, the fear is there. The exact ask is there, in your own handwriting, before you knew how the story would end. And then, months later, sometimes years, you go back, you read what you wrote when you were sure God had forgotten you. And there, on the same page or 3 pages later, is the answer, written in your own hand. Undeniable. You can argue with a feeling. You can't argue with ink. The point isn't the journaling itself. The point is what the journal becomes, the day your faith finally cracks. Because that day is coming. Maybe it's already here. The diagnosis. The empty seat at the table. The prayer you've prayed for 7 years that still hasn't moved. In those seasons, abstract theology won't hold you. Sermon highlights won't hold you. Even Scripture, as alive as it is, can feel distant when your own pain is louder. What holds you is evidence. Specific, dated, personal evidence that the God of the universe has been showing up in your particular life. In your bank account 3 days before rent. In your mother's surgery. In the apology that came 11 months after you stopped expecting it. That's what a prayer journal becomes. A personal book of remembrance, and it turns out God Himself uses this language. In Malachi chapter 3 verse 16, there's a stunning image. Then those who feared the Lord spoke to one another, and the Lord listened and heard them. So a book of remembrance was written before Him, for those who fear the Lord and who meditate on His name. A book of remembrance, written before Him. God keeps a record of His people's faithfulness, and He's inviting you to keep a record of His. So why do almost none of us actually do it? Here's the honest answer. Writing prayers down forces a kind of vulnerability we'd rather avoid. When you pray silently in your car, you can stay vague, you can blur the edges of what you actually want, you can hide from yourself, but when you write it down, Lord, I am terrified my marriage is dying. The hiding ends, the pen pins the fear to the page. You have to look at it, and then you have to look at God, looking at it. That's the discipline. That's the cost. The prayer journal asks you to be specific, and specificity is the enemy of every comfortable Christianity. It's easy to pray, bless my finances. It's terrifying to write, I need $3,200 by the 20th or we lose the apartment. One you can spiritualize away, the other, God either answers or He doesn't. But here's what happens to the person who keeps writing anyway. After a year, you have a record. After 3 years, you have a library. After 10 years, you have something that no skeptic, no dark night, no whispered lie from the enemy can dismantle. Because the evidence is in your handwriting, in your own past tense, in a notebook you can hold in your hands. David understood this. Half the Psalms are essentially prayer journal entries that survived. Psalm chapter 13 verses 1 through 2 opens with David crying out, How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? Real desperation, real ink. And then, 4 verses later in the same psalm, verses 5 through 6, the pivot, but I have trusted in your mercy. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. Same page, same prayer, different ending. David let the record stand. And 3,000 years later, you're still reading it because that honesty is what makes the praise believable. Your journal can do the same thing. For you. For the version of you 6 months from now who will need proof that you've survived this before. There's a practical shape to this you should know. You don't need a leather-bound prayer book. You don't need pretty handwriting. You don't need to write every day. What you need is 3 things on the page when you do write: the date, the actual specific request, and a blank space underneath for when the answer comes. That blank space is where faith lives. Every time you write a prayer, you're declaring, in ink, that you believe God is going to write the second half of the entry someday. You're leaving room for him, and he fills it. Sometimes in ways that don't match what you asked. Sometimes with a no that turns out to be a mercy you couldn't see at the time. Sometimes with a weight that stretches you into someone who can finally receive what you were originally praying for. But he fills it. The Christian who keeps this record long enough develops a kind of unshakable steadiness. Their faith stops being based on the last sermon they heard, or the last worship song that moved them. It starts being based on a documented relationship. This is what Joshua chapter 4 was about. After Israel crossed the Jordan, God told them to take 12 stones out of the riverbed and stack them as a memorial. Why? Joshua chapter 4 verse 7 gives the answer that these stones may be for a memorial to the children of Israel forever. So when your kids ask, you have something to point to. So when you forget, you have something to walk past. Your prayer journal is your pile of stones. Cheaper, quieter, same theology underneath. You might push back here. You might say writing things down feels mechanical, that the Spirit moves freely, that prayer should be Spirit-led, not scheduled and inked. That's fair. The risk is real. A journal can become an idol or a performance. But the same risk applies to fasting, to fixed-hour prayer, to every discipline the saints have used for 2,000 years. The discipline isn't the enemy of the Spirit. Pretending you don't need disciplines is. A prayer journal will eventually expose you. When you go back and read what you asked for 2 years ago, you'll discover 3 things, and all 3 will sting. You'll discover how many prayers God answered that you forgot to thank him for. The job came through. The relationship was restored. The fear didn't come true, and you moved on without ever circling back to acknowledge it. The journal makes that ingratitude visible. You'll discover that some of your most desperate prayers were ones God mercifully refused to answer the way you wanted. The relationship he let end. The door he kept closed. At the time, you were sure you knew what you needed. The record proves otherwise. And this is the one that breaks people open. You'll discover that God was working in directions you weren't even praying about. The healing came in a part of you that you didn't ask him to touch. The growth showed up in a relationship you weren't even worried about. The journal reveals that he's writing a bigger story you weren't competent to ask for. That discovery changes how you pray going forward. You stop bargaining. You stop trying to dictate the terms. You start writing prayers that sound less like a customer at a returns counter and more like a child sitting on a father's lap. The tone shifts. The trust deepens. All because you have evidence, physical, dated, undeniable evidence that this father has been faithful even when you've been forgetful. There's one more thing the journal does that you won't expect. It outlives you. The notebook in your nightstand becomes, someday, the only artifact your grandchildren will have of how you actually walked with God. The real, scribbled, tear-stained record of a person who kept showing up before the throne, even when they didn't feel like it. That's an inheritance. Quieter than money. Worth more. So tonight, before you sleep, find any notebook in your house. Write the date, write the one fear you've been circling for weeks without naming directly. Write it specifically, then leave space underneath for what God is going to do. And then keep going for a month, for a year, for the rest of your life. Because in Lamentations chapter 3, verses 22 through 23, Jeremiah writes from the rubble of Jerusalem the line that should be on the first page of every Christian's journal. Through the Lord's mercies we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. New every morning. Which means there will be something new to record tomorrow, and the morning after, and the morning after that. The proof is already on its way. Make sure there's a page open when it arrives. Pick up the pen.